The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman Thomas Whitmore adjusted his iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat. At 28 years old, Thomas had served in the Coldstream Guards for 6 years, but his posting to ceremonial duties at the palace was still relatively new. He took immense pride in maintaining the centuries-old traditions of the Queen's Guard, understanding that he was not just a soldier, but a living symbol of British heritage and discipline. Thomas stood at his post outside the palace gates with the rigid posture that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training. His polished black boots gleamed in the morning light, and his red tunic was immaculately pressed, every button and insignia positioned with military precision. The heavy ceremonial rifle in his hands was held at exactly the regulation angle, and his eyes stared straight ahead with the unflinching focus that tourists from around the world came to witness. The role of a Queen's Guard required extraordinary mental discipline. Thomas had to remain motionless for hours at a time, ignoring the constant stream of tourists who would pose for photographs, make jokes, or try to get him to break character. Children would wave at him, adults would make funny faces, and occasionally, someone would test his resolve by standing uncomfortably close or making inappropriate comments. Through it all, Thomas maintained his stoic expression and perfect posture, embodying the legendary discipline of the British military. But beneath the ceremonial uniform and rigid exterior, Thomas carried experiences that most tourists could never imagine. Before his assignment to palace duty, he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Coldstream Guards active duty battalion. He had witnessed the brutal realities of modern warfare, lost close friends to improvised explosive devices, and participated in combat operations that had tested every aspect of his training. In character, the transition from active combat duty to ceremonial responsibilities had been more challenging than Thomas had expected. In Afghanistan, he had been responsible for the safety of his fellow soldiers and the success of critical missions. His alertness and quick thinking had saved lives on multiple occasions. Now, his primary duty was to stand perfectly still while maintaining the dignity and tradition of the crown. It was an honor that he took seriously. But it also required a different kind of mental toughness. Thomas had also developed an unexpected expertise during his military service that few people knew about. Growing up in rural Yorkshire, he had been raised by his grandfather, who worked as a veterinarian and dog trainer. Thomas had spent his childhood learning to read animal behavior, understanding the subtle signs that indicated fear, aggression, or distress in various species. This knowledge had proven invaluable during his deployments, where stray dogs and other animals often posed unexpected challenges in urban combat environments. His grandfather, Dr. William Whitmore, had taught Thomas that every animal's behavior was a form of communication, and that understanding this communication was the key to preventing dangerous situations. Thomas had learned to recognize the difference between a dog that was truly aggressive and one that was frightened or protective. He knew how to use body language, tone of voice, and positioning to de-escalate confrontations with animals that could otherwise turn violent. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the area around Buckingham Palace was busier than usual. A large tour group from Japan was taking photographs near the gates, while families with young children pointed excitedly at the colorful ceremony of the changing of the guard that had concluded an hour earlier. Street vendors were selling postcards and souvenirs, and the usual collection of street performers entertained the crowds with music and comedy. The atmosphere was festive and peaceful, exactly the kind of scene that the royal guards were meant to protect and preserve. Thomas had been on duty for 2 hours and had another 2 hours remaining in his shift. His relief, Guardsman Phillips, would arrive at noon to take over the post, allowing Thomas to return to the barracks for lunch and rest. As Thomas maintained his vigilant watch, his trained eye caught movement at the edge of the crowd that seemed different from the typical tourist activity. About 50 meters away, near the Victoria Memorial, a man in his 30s was struggling with a large, powerful dog that was pulling aggressively against its leash. The dog appeared to be a Pitbull, or a similar breed, with the characteristic muscular build and broad head that Thomas recognized from his grandfather's teachings. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that the situation was developing into something potentially dangerous. The dog's body language indicated high levels of stress and aggression, and its owner seemed to be losing control of the situation. The man was yanking hard on the leash, which was only increasing the dog's agitation. While tourists nearby were beginning to notice the disturbance and move away from the area, Thomas's military training kicked in automatically, his senses sharpening. As he assessed the developing threat, he was required to remain at his post and maintain his ceremonial duties. He was also responsible for the safety of the civilians in the area. His mind began calculating distances, escape routes, potential intervention strategies. Even as he continued to stand motionless in his formal position, the crowd was dense enough that if the dog broke free from its owner's control, potentially injure multiple people before anyone could react effectively. Thomas noticed several families with small children in the immediate area, including a group of school children on a field trip who were gathered near the memorial taking group. Photographs the dog's owner appeared to be either inexperienced with handling such a powerful animal or deliberately allowing the situation to escalate. Thomas couldn't determine the man's motivations from his position, but his grandfather's training had taught him to always assume the worst-case scenario. When dealing with aggressive animals in crowded public spaces, as the minutes ticked by, the situation continued to deteriorate. The dog was becoming more agitated, its barks growing louder and more frequent, while its owner seemed to be losing what little control he had maintained. Several tourists were now actively moving away from the area, and Thomas could see concern and fear beginning to spread through the crowd. Thomas knew that his ceremonial duties required him to remain motionless and alert, but his combat experience and protective instincts were telling him that intervention might soon become necessary. The challenge would be determining the exact moment when his responsibility to protect civilians would override his obligation to maintain ceremonial protocol. The tension in the air was palpable as the dog's aggressive behavior intensified. Thomas prepared himself for what might become one of the most challenging situations of his ceremonial career. The situation escalated rapidly when the Pitbull's owner, a man Thomas now observed to be wearing dirty clothing and exhibiting erratic behavior, suddenly released his grip on the leash entirely. Whether this was intentional or accidental was unclear, but the result was immediate chaos, as the powerful dog found itself free in one of London's most crowded tourist areas, the Pitbull. A muscular, brindle-colored animal weighing approximately 60 pounds initially seemed confused by its sudden freedom. It stood still for a moment, head raised, surveying the crowd of people around it with the intense focus that characterized its breed. The dog's ears were pinned back against its head, its tail was rigid and low, and its entire body posture radiated tension and potential aggression. Thomas recognized these warning signs immediately from his grandfather's extensive training. This was not a playful dog that had accidentally gotten loose. This was an animal in a state of high stress and defensive aggression, potentially triggered by the overwhelming sensory input of the crowded tourist area, the unfamiliar urban environment, and possibly inadequate socialization or training. The crowd's reaction was swift and predictable. Tourists began backing away from the loose dog, creating a widening circle of space around the animal. Parents grabbed their children and pulled them close, while tour guides began directing their groups towards safer distances. The normal cheerful chatter of the tourist area was replaced by nervous murmurs and the sound of people moving quickly across the cobblestones. But the crowd's movement seemed to trigger something in the Pitbull's predatory instincts. The rapid motion of people backing away activated its chase response, and the dog began moving toward the densest part of the crowd with purposeful, aggressive strides. Its head was lowered, its muscles were tensed, and its lips were beginning to curl back in a snarl that revealed powerful jaws and sharp teeth. Thomas watched the scene unfold with the heightened awareness that came from his combat training. He could see that the dog was moving directly toward a family with two young children who were struggling to navigate through the crowd quickly enough to escape the approaching threat. The father was carrying a toddler while trying to guide his wife and older child toward safety. But their progress was hampered by the dense crowd of tourists. The dog's target selection seemed to focus on the family's obvious vulnerability and the high-pitched sounds of the children's frightened cries, which may have triggered its aggressive response. Thomas realized that within seconds, the situation would transform from a potential threat into an actual attack that could result in serious injuries or worse. At this critical moment, Thomas faced a decision that would test every aspect of his training, character, and understanding of duty. His ceremonial position required him to remain motionless at his post, maintaining the dignity and tradition of the Queen's Guard, regardless of external circumstances. Breaking protocol could result in serious disciplinary action and potentially end his military career. However, his oath as a soldier included the protection of innocent civilians, and his personal moral code demanded that he act to prevent harm to children and families who would come to enjoy a peaceful day at one of Britain's most important cultural landmarks. The conflict between ceremonial duty and protective instinct created a moment of intense internal struggle. The Pitbull was now less than 10 meters from the struggling family, its aggressive intent becoming increasingly clear to everyone in the area. The father had managed to lift his older child as well, but carrying two children while trying to move quickly through a panicking crowd was proving nearly impossible. The mother was attempting to clear a path, but the press of tourists was creating a dangerous bottleneck that prevented rapid escape. Thomas could see that no one else in the immediate area was positioned or equipped to intervene effectively. The dog's owner had disappeared into the crowd, possibly fleeing the scene to avoid responsibility for what was about to happen. Police officers were visible in the distance, but they were too far away to reach the scene in time to prevent an attack. The dog's body language was becoming increasingly aggressive as it closed the distance to its target. Its hackles were raised, creating a ridge of bristling fur along its back, and its tail was rigid and trembling with tension. Most significantly, Thomas could see that the animal was beginning to bare its teeth and lower its head into the attack position that his grandfather had taught him to recognize as the final warning before a serious bite. In that split second of decision, Thomas's training, instincts, and moral code aligned into a single, clear course of action. He abandoned his ceremonial posture and began moving toward the developing attack with the swift, purposeful movement of a trained soldier, responding to an immediate threat. His decision to leave his post and intervene was made without consideration of the potential consequences to his career or reputation. The only thing that mattered in that moment was preventing a vicious attack on innocent civilians, particularly children who had no ability to defend themselves against such a powerful and dangerous animal. Thomas's movement across the cobblestones was fluid and controlled, covering the distance between his post and the threat with the efficient stride of someone who had been trained to respond to crisis situations. His ceremonial uniform and equipment, normally designed for static display, became secondary to his primary function as a protector of the public. The crowd parted before him as people recognized that the motionless guard was now taking action, creating a clear path toward the escalating confrontation. Some tourists began filming with their phones, capturing what they assumed would be a dramatic confrontation between a soldier and a dangerous animal. But Thomas had no intention of creating a spectacle or engaging in the kind of violent confrontation that most people would expect. Instead, he was drawing upon the specialized knowledge and techniques that his grandfather had taught him, preparing to demonstrate that the most effective way to handle an aggressive animal was not through force or violence, but through understanding, communication, and the kind of calm authority that could transform a dangerous situation into a moment of connection and control. As Thomas closed the distance between himself and the Pitbull, he began implementing the de-escalation techniques that had been passed down to him through his grandfather's decades of experience with animal behavior. The outcome of the next few seconds would determine whether this incident would be remembered as a tragedy or as an extraordinary example of how training, compassion, and understanding could triumph over fear and aggression. As Thomas approached the increasingly agitated Pitbull, he began implementing the specialized techniques his grandfather had taught him. During countless hours of training on the Yorkshire countryside, the first and most crucial step was to control his own energy and body language, projecting calm authority rather than the aggressive confrontation that the dog would expect from humans in this situation? Thomas slowed his approach and lowered his center of gravity, avoiding the direct eye contact and forward-leaning posture that would signal a challenge or threat to the animal. Instead, he angled his body slightly sideways, presenting a less intimidating profile while still maintaining its ability to react quickly if the situation escalated beyond his control. The Pitbull had paused in its advance toward the family, sensing the approach of this new figure who was moving with different energy than the panicking tourists around it. The dog's head turned toward Thomas, its ears rotating to track this unexpected presence that was approaching with confidence rather than fear or aggression. Thomas began speaking in the low, steady tone that his grandfather had taught him was most effective for calming stressed animals. The words themselves were less important than the consistent rhythm and calming frequency of his voice, which could help override the dog's stress response and create a moment of connection that might prevent an attack. "Easy there, mate," Thomas said quietly, his Yorkshire accent adding a warm, familiar quality to his words. "You're all right now? Nobody's going to hurt you?" The effect on the pit bull was immediately noticeable. Its rigid posture began to relax slightly, and its ears shifted from the pinback position of aggression to a more neutral, listening stance. The dog was still alert and potentially dangerous, but Thomas's approach had created a moment of curiosity that interrupted its fixation on the family. Thomas continued his careful advance, maintaining the steady verbal communication while observing every detail of the dog's body, language for signs of renewed aggression or increasing calm. He could see that the animal was not inherently vicious, but rather overwhelmed and defensive in an unfamiliar environment that had triggered its protective instincts. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, creating an almost surreal atmosphere where the only sounds were Thomas's gentle voice and the distant traffic of London. Tourists who had been preparing to flee were now frozen in fascination, watching this unprecedented scene of a Queen's Guard engaging in what appeared to be a conversation with a dangerous animal. "You're just scared, aren't you?" Thomas continued, now within 5 meters of the dog. "All these people, all this noise. It's too much, isn't it?" The pit bull took a tentative step toward Thomas, its head tilted in the characteristic expression of curiosity that dogs display when encountering something unexpected and intriguing. The animal's tail, which had been rigid with tension, began to show the slightest hint of movement that suggested decreasing stress levels. Thomas recognized this as the critical moment where his next actions would determine the outcome of the entire situation. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, reducing his height and presenting an even less threatening posture while bringing himself closer to the dog's level for more effective communication. "Oh, that's right," Thomas said softly, extending his hand, palm down in the universal gesture of peaceful introduction that allows animals to investigate human scent without feeling threatened. "Come and say hello." The transformation in the pit bull's demeanor was remarkable and immediate. The dog approached Thomas's extended hand with the cautious curiosity of an animal that recognized someone who understood its language and respected its boundaries. After a brief investigation of Thomas's scent, the dog looked up into his eyes with an expression that seemed almost grateful for this moment of understanding and connection. Thomas slowly moved his hand to gently scratch behind the dog's ears, a gesture that caused the animal's entire body to relax visibly. The pit bull's tail began wagging tentatively. It leaned into Thomas's touch with the obvious enjoyment of an animal that had been craving positive human interaction. "There we go," Thomas murmured, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a successful intervention. "You're a good dog, aren't you?" Just got a bit overwhelmed with all the excitement. The crowd watching this unprecedented scene was stunned into complete silence. What they had expected to witness was a violent confrontation between a soldier and a dangerous animal. Instead, they were observing something that seemed almost magical, a moment of interspecies communication and understanding that had transformed a potential tragedy into a demonstration of compassion and skill. Thomas continued to calm the dog, while scanning the crowd for its owner, but the man who had released the leash was nowhere to be seen. The pit bull was now sitting peacefully beside Thomas, occasionally looking up at him with the trusting expression of an animal that had found someone who understood and cared for its well-being. Several people in the crowd began taking photographs and videos of the scene, capturing the extraordinary image of a Queen's Guard in full ceremonial uniform, kneeling beside a pit bull that was now behaving like a friendly pet rather than a dangerous predator. The contrast between Thomas's formal military appearance and his gentle interaction with the animal created a powerful visual. It would soon spread far beyond the immediate audience. As the immediate crisis passed, Thomas began to consider the practical aspects of the situation. The dog was clearly lost or abandoned, and he needed to ensure its safety while also returning to his ceremonial duties. The family that had been threatened was now approaching cautiously, their young children, fascinated by the transformation they had witnessed. "Is the doggy okay now?" asked the older child, a girl of about 7 who was peeking out from behind her father's protective embrace. Thomas smiled. The first break in his ceremonial composure that anyone had seen during his months of palace. "Duty. He's perfectly fine," Thomas replied warmly. "He was just frightened and needed someone to help him feel safe." The little girl took a tentative step toward Thomas and the dog, her natural curiosity overcoming her earlier fear. With Thomas's careful supervision, she was able to gently pet the pit bull, which responded with gentle tail wagging and the patient demeanor that well-socialized dogs display around children. This moment of connection between the child and the dog provided a powerful counterpoint to the aggression and fear that had dominated the scene just minutes earlier. It demonstrated that with proper understanding and approach, even animals that appear dangerous can become gentle companions when treated with respect and compassion. Thomas realized that his intervention had not only prevented a potential attack, but it also created an opportunity to educate the public about animal behavior and the importance of responsible pet ownership. The crowd was witnessing firsthand how different approaches to animal encounters could produce dramatically different outcomes. However, Thomas also knew that his departure from ceremonial protocol would likely have consequences that extended beyond this single incident. His commanding officers would need to be informed of his actions, and there would probably be an investigation into whether his intervention was justified or whether he had violated his duties as a Queen's Guard. But as Thomas looked at the peaceful scene around him, the calm dog, the relieved family, and the amazed crowd, he felt confident that he had made the right decision, and that his grandfather would have been proud of how he had handled the situation. As news of the incident spread through the crowd, more and more people began gathering around Thomas and the now peaceful pit bull. The scene had transformed from a potential crisis into something resembling a spontaneous public education session about animal behavior and responsible human-animal interaction. Thomas found himself in the unprecedented position of conducting an impromptu demonstration of animal handling techniques while still wearing his full ceremonial uniform. The pit bull, now completely relaxed and enjoying the attention, had positioned itself comfortably beside Thomas's kneeling form. The dog's transformation from aggressive threat to gentle companion was so complete that many onlookers who had arrived after the initial incident would never have believed how dangerous the situation had been just minutes earlier. Thomas took advantage of this teachable moment to explain some basic principles of animal behavior to the fascinated crowd. "Dogs communicate primarily through body language," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been well trained in the subject. "When we panic and run, or when we approach them aggressively, we're actually speaking their language in ways that can escalate dangerous situations." A teenager in the crowd raised his hand like he was in a classroom. "Oh, so you're saying the dog wasn't actually mean? It was just scared?" "Exactly right," Thomas replied, continuing to gently stroke the pit bull's head. "This fellow here was overwhelmed by all the noise, the crowd, and probably the stress of being in an unfamiliar environment. When his owner lost control of the situation, the dog's natural instincts took over. He wasn't being vicious. He was trying to protect himself in the only way he knew how." An elderly woman stepped forward, her expression showing a mixture of amazement and concern. "But how did you know he wouldn't attack you? Weren't you afraid he might bite?" Thomas smiled, remembering similar questions he had answered during his grandfather's veterinary practice. "There's always some risk when dealing with a stressed animal," he admitted, "but my grandfather taught me to read the signs that indicate whether an animal is truly aggressive or just frightened and defensive. This dog's body language told me he was reachable and could be calmed down with the right approach. The crowd was growing larger as word of the unusual scene spread throughout the tourist area. People were taking photographs and videos, many of which were already being uploaded to social media platforms with captions expressing amazement at the Queen's Guard's unexpected animal handling skills. One of the videos, taken by a Japanese tourist, captured the entire sequence from the moment Thomas left his ceremonial post to his successful calming of the aggressive dog. The footage showed the dramatic transformation of both the animal's behavior and the crowd's reaction, creating a compelling narrative that was beginning to attract international attention online. Thomas became aware that his actions were being documented extensively, and he realized that the incident would likely have far-reaching consequences beyond his immediate military duties. The image of a Queen's Guard demonstrating compassion and skill in handling a dangerous situation was exactly the kind of positive publicity that both the military and the royal family typically embraced. However, Thomas also knew that his departure from ceremonial protocol was a serious breach of regulations that could not be overlooked, regardless of the positive outcome. Queen's Guards were expected to maintain their positions and follow strict protocols under virtually all circumstances, and his decision to intervene personally rather than calling for backup assistance was unprecedented. As Thomas considered these implications, he noticed two police officers approaching through the crowd. The officers were moving purposefully, but without obvious urgency, suggesting that they had been briefed on the situation and understood that the immediate threat had been resolved. Guardsman Whitmore, it's called the senior officer, a sergeant, whose nameplate read Collins. We receive reports of an incident involving a dangerous dog and a member of the Queen's Guard. Thomas carefully stood up, maintaining his gentle contact with the Pitbull to ensure the animal remained calm during this new interaction. Yes, Sergeant. The situation has been contained, but we have a lost or abandoned dog that needs proper care and placement. Sergeant Collins looked around at the peaceful scene with obvious surprise. The reports he had received suggested a much more chaotic and potentially violent situation than what he was observing. I understand there was a threat to civilians? That this animal was attempting to attack tourists? That's correct, Thomas replied professionally. The dog became separated from its owner and was exhibiting aggressive behavior toward a family with young children. I intervened using animal handling techniques to de-escalate the situation. The second police officer, a younger constable, was staring at Thomas with obvious admiration. Sir, we've got multiple videos of what happened here. The footage shows you basically performing a miracle with that dog. How did you learn to do that? Thomas felt a familiar warmth when discussing his grandfather's teachings. My grandfather was a veterinarian and dog trainer in Yorkshire. That most animal aggression is really fear or stress, and that the right approach can usually resolve these situations peacefully. Sergeant Collins nodded approvingly. Well, whatever you did, it worked perfectly. We've contacted Animal Control Services to take custody of the dog, and they should be here within the hour. Do you know anything about the owner? Thomas described the man he had observed losing control of the dog, though he admitted that the individual had disappeared from the scene immediately after the leash was released. The description would be useful for any investigation into whether the incident was accidental or deliberate. As they spoke, Thomas noticed that a small official delegation was approaching through the crowd. He recognized one of the figures as Captain Morrison, his commanding officer, who was accompanied by what appeared to be palace security personnel and possibly media relations staff. The arrival of official representatives meant that Thomas's actions would now be subject to formal review and evaluation. He would need to provide detailed reports explaining his decision-making process and justifying his departure from ceremonial protocols. Captain. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral as he approached, giving no indication of whether Thomas was about to be commended or disciplined for his actions. The presence of media relations staff suggested that the incident had already attracted significant public attention and would require careful handling from a publicity standpoint. Whitmore, Captain Morrison said formally, I need you to provide a full account of today's events for the record. Your actions have attracted considerable attention, and there will need to be a thorough review of the circumstances and your response. Thomas straightened into proper military posture while maintaining his gentle contact with the Pitbull. Yes. Sir, I observed a developing threat to civilian safety and made the decision to intervene using specialized training in animal behavior that I received from my grandfather. The captain's eyebrows rose slightly at this additional information. Thomas's personnel file had mentioned his rural background, but the extent of his specialized knowledge had not been previously documented or considered relevant to his ceremonial duties. Dr. Whitmore, Captain Morrison repeated, your grandfather is a doctor of veterinary medicine? Yes, sir. He operated a practice in Yorkshire for over 40 years and specialized in animal behavior and training. He taught me to recognize and respond to various forms of animal aggression and stress. This revelation added an entirely new dimension to Thomas's actions and would significantly influence how his breach of protocol would be evaluated. Rather than an impulsive abandonment of duty, his intervention could now be seen as the application of legitimate professional expertise to a genuine emergency situation. The formal review of Thomas's actions took place over the following 3 days, during which time the incident had become an international news story. Videos of the Queen's Guard calmly transforming an aggressive pit bull into a gentle companion had been viewed millions of times across social media platforms, generating overwhelmingly positive reactions from viewers around the world. Major news outlets had picked up the story, headlines praising Thomas's courage, skill, and compassion. The BBC ran a feature story titled, The Guard Who Spoke Dog, while international media focused on the extraordinary image of British military tradition combined with unexpected animal expertise. The story had become a powerful example of positive publicity for both the British military and the royal family. Thomas spent the review period on administrative duty while his commanding officers investigated every aspect of the incident. He provided detailed written reports, participated in multiple interviews, and even demonstrated some of his animal handling techniques. Using military working dogs from the Palace Security Unit, the investigation revealed several important factors that strongly supported Thomas's decision to intervene. First, video evidence clearly showed that the pit bull was indeed approaching the family with aggressive intent, and that no other assistance was immediately available to prevent a potential attack. Second, Thomas's intervention had been successful in preventing injury while also resolving the situation peacefully. Most significantly, the military's own experts in canine behavior reviewed the footage and confirmed that Thomas's techniques were textbook examples of proper animal de-escalation methods. His approach had minimized risk while maximizing the likelihood of a positive outcome. Exactly what would be expected from someone with legitimate training in animal behavior. Captain Morrison called Thomas into his office on Thursday morning to discuss the findings of the review. Thomas entered the office in full dress uniform, prepared for whatever consequences his actions might have generated. The captain's expression was still carefully neutral, though Thomas thought he detected a hint of something that might have been approval. Guardsman Whitmore, Captain Morrison began formally. The review board has completed its evaluation of your actions during the incident on Tuesday morning. I need to discuss our findings with you. Thomas stood at attention, his eyes focused straight ahead in the traditional military manner. Yes, sir. Your decision to leave your ceremonial post was a clear violation of standing orders and established protocol. The captain continued. Under normal circumstances, such an action would result in disciplinary measures and possibly affect your continued service with the ceremonial unit. Thomas's heart sank slightly, though he remained at attention. He had known that consequences were likely, and he was prepared to accept responsibility for his decision to prioritize civilian safety over ceremonial protocol. However, Captain Morrison continued, and Thomas detected a slight smile in his voice, the circumstances of this incident were far from normal, and your response demonstrated exceptional judgment and expertise that prevented what could have been a serious tragedy. The captain stood and walked around his desk, to face Thomas directly. The review board has concluded that your actions were not only justified, but exemplary. You identified a genuine threat to civilian safety, applied specialized training to resolve the situation peacefully, and maintained the honor and reputation of the Queen's Guard throughout the entire incident. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he continued to maintain his military bearing. The possibility of disciplinary action had been weighing heavily on his mind, particularly since he was genuinely proud of his service and had no desire to leave the ceremonial unit. Furthermore, Captain Morrison added, your actions have generated extraordinarily positive publicity for the British military and have demonstrated the high caliber of personnel serving in the Queen's Guard. The palace has received hundreds of communications praising your conduct and expressing admiration for the training and character of our guardsmen. The captain returned to his desk and picked up a formal document. Therefore, rather than facing disciplinary action, you are being formally commended for exceptional service and devotion to duty. This commendation will be added to your permanent record and will be considered favorably for any future promotions or special assignments. Thomas was stunned by this unexpected outcome. He had hoped to avoid serious consequences, but he had never imagined that his actions might actually be rewarded with official recognition. Thank you, sir, Thomas replied, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. I was simply doing what I felt was necessary to protect the public. Captain Morrison smiled for the first time during their conversation. That attitude, guardsman, is exactly why you're receiving this commendation rather than a reprimand. Your instincts were correct, your execution was flawless, and your motivations were entirely proper. The captain then shared some additional information that Thomas found both surprising and gratifying. The incident had prompted discussions at the highest levels of military leadership about incorporating more specialized training into the ceremonial guard units. Recognizing that modern security challenges might require skills beyond traditional military drill and ceremony, your expertise in animal behavior has been noted as a potentially valuable asset, Captain Morrison explained. There's been discussion about having you provide training to other members of the unit and possibly developing formal protocols for handling similar situations in the future. Thomas was honored by this recognition of his grandfather's teachings and the possibility that his specialized knowledge might benefit his fellow guardsmen. The idea of sharing his grandfather's wisdom with other soldiers felt like a meaningful way to honor the legacy of Dr. William Whitmore's decades of work with animals. Over the following weeks, Thomas's story continued to generate positive attention. He received letters from children around the world expressing admiration for his kindness to the dog, and from adults praising his professional handling of a difficult situation. Several animal welfare organizations reached out to discuss his techniques and their potential applications in various settings. The Pitbull from the incident, whom Thomas had privately named Wellington after the famous Duke, had been placed in the care of a reputable animal rescue organization. Thomas had maintained contact with the rescue group and learned that the dog was responding well to proper care and training, confirming his assessment that the animal's aggressive behavior had been situational rather than inherent. Most meaningfully, for Thomas, his grandfather had called from Yorkshire after seeing the news coverage. Dr. William Whitmore, now in his 80s, had expressed tremendous pride in how Thomas had applied their training. It had told him that his response to the crisis exemplified everything he had tried to teach about understanding and respecting animal behavior. The incident had also created a new dimension to Thomas's ceremonial duties. Tourists who recognized him from the viral videos would often approach his post to express their admiration, and he had become something of a celebrity among the international visitors to Buckingham Palace. However, Thomas remained focused on maintaining the dignity and tradition of his ceremonial role while carrying the additional responsibility of representing the positive values that his actions had demonstrated. He understood that his response to one critical moment had created lasting expectations for his conduct and character. The transformation from a routine day of ceremonial duty to international recognition had been unexpected and sometimes overwhelming. But Thomas felt grateful that his grandfather's teachings had enabled him to make a positive difference in a dangerous situation, while bringing honor to his military service and his family's legacy of animal care. 6 months after the incident that had transformed his life, Guardsman Thomas Whitmore stood at the same post outside Buckingham Palace, where everything had begun. His red tunic was as immaculately pressed as ever. His bearskin hat sat at the bestkin, perfect regulation angle, and his ceremonial rifle was held with the same military precision that had characterized his service from the beginning. But everything else about his role and responsibilities had changed. Dramatically, Thomas had become something far more significant than just another Queen's Guard, maintaining ceremonial tradition. He had evolved into a living symbol of how military service could extend beyond traditional boundaries to encompass compassion, expertise, and genuine care for public welfare. The incident with the Pitbull had revealed hidden depths of character and training that had elevated him from anonymous ceremonial duty to international recognition. The changes in Thomas's daily routine reflected his expanded role within the palace security structure, while he still maintained his ceremonial duties. He had also been assigned additional responsibilities that utilized his unique expertise in animal behavior. The palace grounds were home to numerous animals, from the famous corgi dogs to various wildlife that found sanctuary in the extensive gardens. And Thomas had become the unofficial liaison between the security forces and these animal residents. His most significant new responsibility involved training other members of the ceremonial guard units in basic animal handling techniques. Once a month, Thomas conducted workshops where he shared his grandfather's teachings with fellow guardsmen, preparing them to handle similar situations should they arise in the future. These sessions had proven so valuable that requests had come from other ceremonial units throughout the British military to provide similar training. The workshops were held in a converted classroom within the palace complex, where Thomas had created a comprehensive curriculum covering animal behavior recognition, de-escalation techniques, and safety protocols. Using a combination of theoretical instruction and practical demonstrations with specially trained animals, Thomas was able to pass on the knowledge that his grandfather had shared during those long afternoons in Yorkshire. The key to understanding any animal, Thomas would tell his students, echoing his grandfather's words, is recognizing that their behavior is always communication. They're telling you about their emotional state, their needs, and their intentions. Our job is to learn their language well enough to respond appropriately. The success of these training programs had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies and animal welfare organizations throughout Britain. Thomas had been invited to speak at conferences and seminars, sharing his techniques with police officers, park rangers, and other professionals who regularly encountered animals in their work. One particularly memorable speaking engagement had taken place at the Royal Veterinary College, where Thomas had addressed an audience of veterinary students and faculty. Standing before the same institution where his grandfather had received his training decades earlier, Thomas felt a powerful connection to the legacy he was carrying forward. My grandfather always taught me that the most dangerous animal encounters occur when humans react from fear rather than understanding, Thomas had told the veterinary students. When we take the time to observe, interpret, respond with knowledge instead of emotion, we can transform potential tragedies into moments of connection and learning. The veterinary college had been so impressed with Thomas's presentation that they had offered him a position as a guest lecturer, teaching a course on animal behavior in public safety contexts. Thomas had accepted the role, which allowed him to continue his military service while also pursuing his passion for animal welfare and education. Meanwhile, Wellington, the Pitbull from the original incident, had become something of a celebrity. In his own right, the animal rescue organization that had taken custody of him had documented his rehabilitation and eventual placement with a loving family. Thomas had maintained contact with Wellington's new owners, a retired couple who had extensive experience with rescue animals and who had been specifically chosen for their ability to provide the patient understanding care that Wellington needed. The transformation in Wellington's life paralleled Thomas's own journey from that critical day 6 months earlier. Under proper care and training, the dog had revealed the gentle, intelligent nature that Thomas had recognized beneath his defensive aggression. Wellington now served as a therapy dog, visiting hospitals and nursing homes where his calm presence brought comfort to patients and residents. Thomas had visited Wellington several times at his new home, and the reunion between the guardsmen and the dog had provided some of the most heartwarming footage in the ongoing media coverage of their story. The image of Wellington enthusiastically greeting Thomas, tail wagging with obvious joy and recognition, had reinforced the public's perception of their special bond, and the lasting impact of Thomas's compassionate intervention. The broader impact of the incident had extended far beyond Thomas's individual recognition. The positive publicity generated by his actions had contributed to increased public support for the British military and had helped humanize the often formal and distant image of the Royal Guards. Tourism to Buckingham Palace had increased significantly, with many visitors specifically hoping to see the dog whisperer guardsman would become an international sensation. More importantly, the incident had sparked conversations about the multiple roles that modern military personnel might be called upon to fill. Thomas's story had demonstrated that soldiers trained for combat could also possess skills and knowledge that made them valuable contributors to civilian safety and animal welfare in ways that traditional military training might not have anticipated. The British military had taken note of these lessons and had begun incorporating more diverse skill assessments into their personnel evaluations. Soldiers with backgrounds in veterinary medicine, animal training, psychology, and other specialized areas were now being identified and positioned where their unique expertise could complement their military training. Thomas's grandfather, Dr. William Whitmore, had become something of a celebrity himself as media outlets discovered the source of Thomas's remarkable animal handling skills. At 82 years old, Dr. Whitmore had been interviewed by numerous news programs and had even been invited to visit London to see his grandson's work at the palace. The reunion between grandfather and grandson at Buckingham Palace had been deeply emotional for both men. Dr. Whitmore had been able to see firsthand how his decades of patient teaching had prepared Thomas not just for that one critical moment, but for a lifetime of service that honored both military tradition and compassionate animal care. "I always knew that what I was teaching you would be useful someday," Dr. Whitmore had told Thomas during their reunion. "But I never imagined it would make such a difference to so many people around the world." As Thomas stood at his ceremonial post on this anniversary morning, he reflected on how much his life had changed while also remaining fundamentally the same. He was still a soldier, still committed to serving his country and protecting the public, still proud to wear the uniform that represented centuries of British military tradition. But he was also now something more, a bridge between different worlds of service, a teacher sharing knowledge that could prevent tragedies, and a living reminder that the most powerful military action is sometimes the gentlest. Response to a dangerous situation, the morning tourists were beginning to gather around the palace gates, and Thomas noticed several families with young children pointing at him with obvious excitement. Some of them were undoubtedly hoping to witness another dramatic animal rescue. But Thomas was content knowing that his most important contribution was not the spectacular incident that had made him famous, but the ongoing work of training, teaching, and demonstrating that understanding and compassion could be just as powerful as any weapon in a soldier's arsenal. As he resumed his ceremonial stance, Thomas carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that his grandfather's legacy lived on through every guardsman he had trained, every dangerous situation that had been resolved peacefully, and every person who had learned to see animals not as threats to be feared, but as fellow creatures deserving of understanding and respect. The transformation from that one critical moment had created ripple effects that would continue long after Thomas's own service ended, ensuring that the lessons learned from a frightened Pitbull and a compassionate guardsman would influence how future generations of soldiers and civilians approach the delicate balance between duty, safety, and mercy.